Hello and welcome to another video where I review some old rules. Today I'm looking at For King or Empress, which is fast play rules for battles covering 7 Years' War, and the supplement to it, which covers the War of Austrian Succession. Now I've been looking for 7 Years' War rules for many years, probably 30 or 40 years. I've gone through many different rule sets, read some and decided that's not what I'm looking for. And then I've read some and played and just haven't really found the one rule set that I totally like. I don't know if that rule set is out there. Each one has their own strengths and weaknesses. So I'm going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses for King or Empress. So let's take a quick run through the rules, and then I'm going to show you some of the mechanics, and then I'm going to have a sort of a montage of a battle I did probably about 3.5 years ago, and just show you how the rules played out at that time. So the rules are by First Command Wargames, written by Steve Verliva. Sorry, Steve, if I messed up your name. They came out in 2016. And they're available as a download on Lulu and also wargamesvault.com. And you can see, it has line drawings in black and white pictures. It's it is a 44-page rule set. And actually the rules take up, if you include the game design through the end of the rules, it's only 14 pages, right? With the line drawings and the pictures as well, the black and white pictures. So it does have a table of contents you can see here, and goes through the game design. It's designed for 10 millimeter armies, 10 millimeter scale armies, where 100 yards equals an inch, or an inch equals 100 yards, however you want to describe that. The basing is infantry's on 40 by 30 stands. Okay, so you can see here we have 40 by 30. This is Prussian infantry. And then cavalry is on a 40 by 40 stand. What they recommend, though, I can't really reproduce on this scale. So for cavalry, they suggest 8 figures. Well, actually, I guess I can. And in some cases, you can. It's really tight. You can see on the cavalry. Let me see if I can get a better picture of this over here. It's really tight. And I guess I'm okay with that. The infantry, though, they're suggesting really 16 figures. Depending on the figures themselves, I can kind of get 16 on there. It's really cramped, but I prefer 10 figures per stand. Right? That's not as cramped. I just so happen to have been able to put these Prussians, or I put 13 on here because they, they're firing. Their figures are firing in a firing pose. So I was able to get them a little tighter. So 16 or so is really, really tight. And then artillery also is on 40 by 40. What do you need to play? You need 6-sided dice. You need a 12-sided dice. I don't have the 12-sided dice on the table right now. Tape measures and rulers. You need something to show that artillery is fired, cotton balls or something like that. You need markers for the it says for the CNC's initiative, and then something that will show angles if you're really. It's not needed, but you can do angle. You have some sort of template that shows you the different angles for if something is within firing arc or not. It is a card activated system, so each general will have a card. So this one you can see is Dawn, at least one card. Your good and excellent generals will have 2 cards in the deck. Okay, so for instance, Frederick, will have 2 cards, both the same thing, right? So they go into the deck. Each general gets at least 1 card, and then there are 2 reshuffle cards. So what happens at the beginning of each turn, put all the cards into a deck, shuffle them, and then when a commander's card is turned over, so let's say Moritz, okay, so he then activates, or at least tries to activate. Okay, so he fails his activation on a 1 or a 2, and then on these cards I basically put their command radius and their movement and so forth, so that when you're playing, you don't have to refer back to another sheet. It's right there. And then what happens is if the second reshuffle card comes up, then the turn is over. So you could have a case where there's a general who doesn't get a chance to activate that turn. Now the good and excellent commanders will have, like I said, have 2 cards in there. So their chances of activating are good in a turn. But once you pull a card for someone who has 2 cards in the deck, if you pull the second card, then they don't get to activate. They don't get 2 activations a turn. They just have 2 chances to activate. And then you have to roll their activation, and they could fail, depending on their quality. Either a 1 or a 2 is a failure, and they don't get to move. So then there's information about movement. It's very simple. It's standard movement rates, and I'll show you the movement rates when we get to the list in the back. And then there's march move. So when you activate, you can move. If you're within 8 inches of an enemy, you only get 1 movement, right? So let's say it's 4 inches. You can move 4 inches towards that enemy. But if you're beyond 8 inches, you can move twice. And in certain cases, you could move 3 times, but you have to take a morale check. Each unit will have a combat quality, and you roll 1 die to roll. If you roll less than their combat quality, it causes a hit on the enemy. I'll show that to you in a minute when we go through the list again. And so each hit then will cause the target to be disordered, and they have to then take a morale check, and they could possibly fall back. Morale is done on a D20, and again, you need to roll that number or less. There are certain combat modifiers that will add an additional hit. Like for instance, if you're firing against someone who is mounted and bad going, then they will take an additional hit. And once you take 4 disorder markers, then your unit is eliminated. In some cases, you get the 3rd disorder marker and you fail your morale, then you're eliminated. Otherwise, you're unaffected. But once you get that 4th one, you're eliminated. There is a point system in here. There's a chart for determining commander ratings if you want. There's information about the terrain, and then it has a nice summing up. 7 things you need to think about when you're playing. Really, what happens at the end? Let me go back to this page when it talks about winning and losing. There are suggested morale breakpoints. In some cases, it's like 15 to 20%, or maybe even 30% of your total number of units in your army. Once you lose that many, then you have to start taking morale checks. And once you fail your morale, then you lose and the game is over. It does have some recommended morale ratings for each army list, but you can modify that per scenario. If you want to make it 25% instead of the suggested 20% for an army, you can do that. It's not set in stone, especially if you're just playing a one-off game. There's something in here for terrain generation, and there are historical and optional rules, to add more flavor. And then really about a third of the book is army list. Okay, so it gives you, we go across here. Let's see if I can make it a little bit closer. Okay, so this has the Anglo-Allied army list. It gives you your movement rates for good and bad going, and on the road, and if there's a firing range, but these top ones are cavalry, so they're not going to have firing range. And then your combat factor against your target. So if you're against infantry, the horse guards need a 2 or less, but against other cavalry, they need a 4 or less. Then it has their morale, which is they need to, whenever they have to take a morale check, they need to roll 16 or less. And then when you're building a point-based army, this is how many points there are. And so you can see, even the British Guard here, are the fire factors are 4 and 4. It has a short range, okay, and if you're shooting, it's only 2 inches in most cases. And then the artillery is about, you have a close range, which is up to 2 inches, and then a long or effective range up to 8 inches, and it also depends on the artillery. There's no difference in most cases between a 6-pounder, 12-pounder, 24. It all just assumes it in one. The goal of these rules are to be fast play. It's not designed to have a lot of detail unless you want to bring in some of the optional rules. Then it also gives some suggested army list here, like the number, sort of the minimum and maximum that you can have in each list. So it has a small Anglo-Allied list, which comes out to about 54.5 points with 2 generals, gives it an army morale rating of 20% and 14 morale rating. So when they lose 20% of their units, they would then have to roll a morale check based on 14 or less. And then there's a large army list as well that gives bigger ranges, and the suggested one that they have was about 158.5 points. And then it also gives you some guidelines if you're building the large army list for how many generals you can have, how much artillery, and so forth, how your elite units, your guard and grenadiers, and so forth. So for each army list, it will give sort of restrictions and guidelines. There's a list for the Austrians, right? An early and late war. This is what I like. One thing I like about this is it does have an early and late war list for some of the armies that would, that as the war went on, the quality of their troops weren't as good. Then there's French. There are early and late Prussian army lists. There's even Prince Henry's forces for late war. And then there are the Reichsarmy. If you really feel like you want to put together the Reichsarmy, and Russians as well. Oh, and then Saxony and Sweden. I forgot about those two. Some rules I've seen only cover, the main protagonists, Prussia, Russia, Austria, France, and Britain. but this does have more in here. So I like that. And then, of course, at the end are the quick reference. That's a quick reference sheet. Now, the War of Austrian Succession, most of this is the same. We'll have the army list. It's a little bit different in who's covered, and the format's a little bit different. This came out, when did this one come out? In 2022. Again, this is available through Lulu, and I've seen it on wargamesvault.com. I've actually seen on Amazon, and I think on Military Matters does have this in hardback if you want to get it in hardback. I don't know if the original, if this version of For King or Empress, if this is available in hardback anymore. When I checked on Lulu, it is it's only available in PDF. I didn't see an option to do a printing, which I thought was kind of odd because I thought that was the whole purpose of Lulu. Anyway, there's a lot of information about the War of Austrian Succession in here, all the different battles, and then there are optional and new rules for 7 Years' War and War of Austrian Succession. One of the rules that I thought was that they added that I would use in 7 Years' War, to bring into For King or Empress, is the rule about passage of lines. In the original rules, only, I think, light infantry, light cavalry could pass through other units. I think other units could pass through artillery, but you couldn't do a passage of lines, which I thought was one of the weaknesses when I played the game a few years ago. One of the weaknesses, because as you had casualties in your front line and they fell back, the rules didn't specifically say you could take a fresh unit and move through. And I figured you could easily house rule that. But in the Austrian Succession book, it does have an allowance for the passage of lines. Then there's some other, updates and suggestions that you can incorporate into the 7 Years' War rules, into the main one. But there's only about really taking out if you exclude the photographs and line drawings and such, it's only maybe 2 pages at most of suggested changes. And there's other army lists for the nations and the armies that fought in the War of Austrian Succession. Even has the Ottomans. It has the Piedmont Sardinians, Russians, and so forth. So that's most of the. And it also does have the Battle of Mollwitz in here as well, that you can, if you want, you can recreate that one. It gives you all the information about the armies and the commanders and so forth for that. And that's essentially the War of Austrian Succession supplement. So now I'm going to spend some time going through some of the rule mechanics and show you using the figures, and we'll take it from there. So here we have 2 forces. One on the right is the Austrians, and let's say it's commanded by Don, and the other one on the left are Prussians, and let's say that they're commanded by Moritz, Prince Moritz. So let's say when we start off in the turn, Don's card is pulled first, so he's a good commander. He fails on a roll of a 1. He's got a command radius of 10, and move of 20 inches himself. When his card is drawn, we then roll a die, and he rolls a 2. Luckily, it's not a 1, and then he can activate. So let's say that he moved his troops up and within 2 inches of the Prussians. Now, of course, the one thing I like about these rules is that you can command a large number of forces. Each stand represents a battalion or a group of cavalry and a number of guns in a battery. In a large battle, you can put together, 3 or 4 different commands, each with, 10 or so, 10, 15 units in that command, and you really run a large battle with them. In a real game, Don would have plenty more troops with him in his command. So we start off by, let's say they come within 2 inches and he wants to shoot. Each one of these Austrian infantry battalions are going to shoot at the Prussian infantry. Now, firing is optional. They don't have to. When they come within 2 inches, they're not forced to shoot. It is an optional rule. And the target has to be within their 22-degree arc. We're going to roll a red die for this one and a green die for that one. And we see that the green die is the only one that hits. The Austrians have a combat factor of 3. Since this is the Prussians' first hit, they would take a disorder marker. Now let's say in a couple turns later, the Austrians fire again and would put a same roll. Put another disorder marker on that unit. The Prussian would have to roll a d20 and roll less than their morale number in order to pass the check. Let's get something better. He rolled a 13 and his morale is a 14, so he's good. Let's say he rolled, when he received the second disorder marker, he rolled a 20 on his morale. He would recoil and then withdraw. So a recoil is essentially a push back 1 base width, and then the withdrawal is a 1d6 movement to the rear. So in this case, he would go back 2 more inches and face the other way, right? So let's say he's back here and he's got, his disorder. Melee combat is very similar, right? It's the same. Let's say we're in melee now. Now both sides will roll. This time I'm just going to do the front unit where the Prussians are green and the Austrians are red. Again, you're looking for the combat factor. Now for the Prussians, combat factor is a 4, so they're better against infantry in the early phase than the Austrians are. The Austrians are 3s against other infantry. The Russians are 4. Now when it comes to the late phase, the late war, then they're both 3s. Okay, so we get a hit on the Austrian, but the Austrian does not do a hit on the Prussian. In this case, the Prussian is the winner because they inflicted more hits on the Austrians. If, for instance, they didn't have any hits, or that they both inflicted the same number of hits on the other, they would be locked in combat, but you still would have to take a morale check. So in a case like this, because this is their first and it's melee combat, the Austrian falls back. And the second one, let's see what happens in this one. Oh, both roll a 1, so both put a hit on the other. So they remain locked in combat, and since they did the same number of hits, we roll again, and whoever rolls the highest is considered the winner, and the other is the the loser, and would take another hit. So in this case, this is the only time where rolling high in this game is good, right? So the Austrian would take another hit and would recoil and would have to take a morale check because they have their second disorder. Since they have 2 hits, they would have to take a morale check, and they roll a 12 and they pass. That's basically how you do the combat, the melee combat and the firing combat. There is a mechanism for recovering the disorder markers. So if a unit is more than 4 inches from an enemy unit and they have not engaged in any combat this turn, they can roll morale to recover one of the disorders. So this unit here, their morale is a 14. They rolled an 11, so they can remove one of the disorder markers. Because they're more than 4 inches from the Prussians, and let's assume that they did not engage in any firing or any other combat this turn. That's how you can recover. Now, it does say that if you have ever had to withdraw, you cannot recover your last disorder. When I played, I simply disregarded that rule. That way I didn't have to keep track of those units that had withdrawn. I felt playing these rules really showed that it does what they say. It does what it says on the tin. They are fast play rules. You can play the large battles quickly. I think when I had about 45 to 50 units, both infantry, cavalry, and artillery on the board, it probably took no more than 2.5 hours. I was playing solo. Depending on your gaming group, it could go a little longer, could go less than that, just depending on how much kibitzing you do during the game. But I found the rules to be very straightforward, quite easy to pick up. There's not a lot of details in the rules. There's not a lot of things to remember. Spent most of the time just referencing the QRS. Didn't have to go back into the rules too much. And overall, it was a fun game. I wish I could get it on the table more often, but my gaming interests have moved around a bit in the past 3 years. But I still go back to wanting to do 7 Years' War, and when I do, I'm going to use these rules. Back in 2022, I had the opportunity to run a solo game of For King or Empress. Had I thought about it at the time, I would have taken a video of the game, but instead, I'm using still images I took as the basis for this narrative. The Prussian order battle consisted of 4 different commands under Frederick the Great. 2 cavalry commands, one led by Zieten and one by Seydlitz, where Zieten had 4 cuirassiers and 2 dragoons, while Seydlitz had 3 cuirassiers and 2 dragoons. Moritz held the center with the guard and grenadier infantry, while Dona held the left flank. Points-wise, the Prussians came out to 176 points based on the early war lists. The Austrians also had 4 commands under Daun, 2 cavalry commands, one commanded by Lacy and one with Buffling, and 2 infantry commands, one by Loudon and one by McGuire. Not to foreshadow anything, but I'm not even sure why we fielded McGuire. He didn't really do anything in the battle. Despite having a superiority in cavalry numbers, the Austrian total came to 161.5 points, which was about 14.5 less than the Prussians. Here you see the initial deployment and terrain on the 6x4 table. The lower half of the table was dominated by a stream and woods that pretty much bisected the middle half of the table, with a hill, a row of hills on the right-hand side of this picture. The Austrians split their command with the two cavalry commands at the far end of the table and Maguire's command on their right flank. The Austrian plan was to hold the Prussian right flank with Loudon in the two cavalry commands, while Maguire crossed the stream and took the hill on the far side. Anticipating this, the Prussians' plan was basically to attack Loudon in the center and destroy it before Maguire could put any pressure on their left flank. The Prussians deployed Ziethen's cavalry on the far right, Moritz and his infantry in the center, and Dohna and his infantry on a hill on the far left. Seydlitz was to be the reserve and respond to whichever flank was threatened the most. The Austrians deployed both of their cavalry commands on their far left and Loudon's infantry on the right. Down, you can see, is in the center so that he can support whichever flank is threatened the most. Here you see a shot of the center of the table. Most of the action would take place between the forests that are on the left of this picture and the stream and forest on the right. Here's a shot of Maguire's command. Again, not even sure why I put him on the table. The battle started with both Moritz and Loudon advancing towards each other in the center of the table, with the cavalry engaging on the Prussian far right wing. It wasn't long before the heavy cavalry hit each other. Both Lacy and Ziethen threw their commands at each other. Here's an overhead shot of that cavalry action. In For King or Empress, whenever there is close combat, the units have to align with each other, similar to the DBX series of games. And you can see the 5 units of Austrian cuirassiers are overlapping the 4 units of Prussian cuirassiers. But this advantage did not matter. Despite their numerical superiority and also despite throwing in the second line as reserves, the Austrian cavalry pretty much broke. Although they got the better of the Austrian cavalry, the Prussians were so spent that they spent the rest of the game trying to recover from disorder. It was a hard-fought battle in the center between the two infantry forces. And here's also where I realized that there was a potential issue with the rules. As I mentioned before, in the original rules, it did not allow for passage of lines. So when you had a front line unit that was pretty much destroyed or had 3 disorders, it was very difficult to, if not impossible, to do a passage of lines. You kind of had to hope that frontline unit would break and then you could bring in your reserve. That's how I played the rules in this game. But as I mentioned before, in the War of Austrian Succession supplement, the author has clarified, and now you can do a passage of lines between infantry units. Both sides were taking a beating in the center, but the Austrians finally broke when the Prussians threw in their reserve grenadiers. Not much happened on the Austrian right/Prussian left flank. This was because Maguire either failed his initiative roll or his card didn't come up before the second reshuffle card appeared. He did manage to throw his Grinzers up towards the stream, and Dohna, tired of sitting around and waiting for the attack to come, threw in a couple of battalions of infantry to oppose the grenadiers. The game ended after 6 turns once Loudon's command and Lacy's command broke. The Austrians had reached their 20% threshold for army breakpoint and subsequently failed their army morale with the roll of a 20. I found the game to be quite enjoyable, even though I was playing solo. It didn't bother me. It was fast play. Playing solo, I managed to get those 6 turns in about 2.5 hours, and it came with a positive result. I hope you've enjoyed the rules review and the walkthrough of the battle that I played. If you'd like to see more videos like this, I encourage you to like and subscribe. Thank you and have a good day.